Hi Ryan, I'm back. It's me. I'm here to talk about the election, the craziness of this election. We're in the middle of a pretty unusual type of election. They're not always like this, but I do think, as I mentioned in my last video, that sometimes, maybe about every 50 years or so, American politics has something crazy happened with their election. So last time I talked about 1968 and how crazy that election got. There's a link in the description if you didn't see that one. But today I want to talk about 50 years before that. Not exactly 50 years, but like approximately 50 years. And look at the 1912 election, one of my personal favorites. There's a lot of context you need to be aware of when looking at the 1912 election. First of all, Teddy Roosevelt has already been president. He was president from 1900 to 1908. So he's already been president twice. When Roosevelt had ended that second term in 1908, he sort of handpicked his successor, Taft. So by the time you get to 1912, Taft is the Republican president, but things are in a weird period of transition right now. There's a very active movement in a large portion of the American electorate called progressivism. Now, in the early 20th century, when people use the term progressivism, it doesn't quite mean exactly the way we use it today. These progressives are actually really diverse. It can mean a lot of different things. Most progressives wanted some sort of major social change. They wanted to maybe change working conditions in factories, or maybe some of them wanted more moral issues like to introduce prohibition. When we're talking about these labor issues and working issues, it's worth understanding how bad things were in terms of big business oppression in the early 1900s. There's basically no labor laws happening at this point. So you have child labor, you have people working 60, 70, maybe 80-hour weeks, and those people are still living in poverty. Conditions in the workplace are horrific. And I don't just mean like, oh, your coworkers are annoying or they don't have enough coffee. I mean, people are dying in the factories. For example, about a year before this was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. What happened there is a clothing factory lit on fire and 146 workers, mostly women, died inside. Why couldn't they escape the fire? Because their bosses had literally chained the doors shut because they were worried their workers were taking too many breaks. So the type of people that were against these types of practices, those people are called progressives, but it's not just that. There are different people calling themselves progressives. They don't agree on what they want. They don't agree on how they want to go about these changes, but they do agree that some sort of change needs to happen. There's a lot of tension going on as well, especially with these labor issues. Sometimes these progressives who are protesting big business could be beaten or even killed in the streets by cops or by private mercenaries that were hired by businesses. In some cases, there's like actual battles going on. For example, in 1911, right before this election, there was the Illinois Central Shopman strike where some railroad workers went on strike to get more humane conditions. When the corporations tried to send in replacement workers, violence broke out and 12 people were killed. In the same year of 1911, the Westmoreland County coal strike in Pennsylvania, coal miners went on strike to try to get better conditions for themselves, and corporations sent in their own internal security forces that they hired, as well as local and state police. And even though those strikers had a permit to have a protest march, the chief of police literally led men on horseback to charge the strikers and beat them with clubs. 16 people were killed. And those are just two examples. But so this kind of violence between big companies and their employees was not uncommon during the decades leading up to this election. So it's into this context that the election happens. Remember that this is a time about 100 years ago when the party identities were a lot different than they are today. Like the Democrats at the time are the conservative party associated with the South. The Republicans are generally associated with the North and are more sympathetic to big business and corporations. So the Democrats have a really crowded field early on in this election cycle. There are 7 candidates fighting for the Democratic nominee spot. And even though there are these kind of corrupt political machines that operated at the time, and they sort of controlled the Democratic Party. This is a system, by the way, it's called Tammany Hall, and they use a combination of graft and corruption, political favors to basically control politics on every level. The bosses of those political machines, you could think of them as like the party establishment for the time. They're pushing a guy named Champ Clark. He is Speaker of the House at the time. And one of the big movers and shakers in the Democratic Party around this time is William Jennings Bryan. How to describe William Jennings Bryan? Well, the lion in The Wizard of Oz is supposed to be symbolic of him, if that tells you anything.
Wouldn't you feel degraded to be seen in the company of a cowardly lion? I would.
Bryan is basically the unofficial leader of what's called the populist movement. He's all about supporting rural farmers, and he's very anti-big business. Imagine like if Bernie Sanders only cared about farmers and was also like a super extreme evangelical Christian. Now, Bryan has run for president a few times before this and failed himself, and even though he's not running this time, he's got major pull within the Democratic Party. So William Jennings Bryan comes out and says, hey, screw the big machine. I don't want this guy Clark that the bosses are pushing. I want Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson, he's like an academic. He's been the governor of New Jersey, but he's also been the president of Princeton. Wilson's also like an old school Southern Democrat. He's like crazy racist, but he also thinks, like a lot of old school Southern Democrats at the time, that big business, which is tied to the Republican Party, is ruining everything. So Wilson wants to further this progressive cause and reform everything. So he's very idealistic in a sense. What about the Republicans? Well, like I said before, Teddy Roosevelt had already run for 2 terms, and Taft, his buddy, has been president for 1 term as well. And Taft is now up for his re-election. And Teddy Roosevelt is really not happy about this. But Teddy Roosevelt had gotten kind of more and more progressive over the years, and basically he thought that Taft was doing everything wrong. So Teddy Roosevelt is so frustrated with Taft that he decides to run against him for the Republican nomination. And you have to understand how intensely popular Teddy Roosevelt is. People love this guy. This is why we call teddy bears Teddy. They're named after Teddy Roosevelt. The guy has a huge fan base. Now, also running as a Republican is Bob La Follette, who is a big-time progressive. So you have Roosevelt and La Follette, and they're battling it out, and they're winning primaries in various states. Roosevelt is winning most of them. He even wins Taft's home state of Ohio. But Taft had support consolidated in the South. There's this major schism happening in the party. Most of the delegates are going to Taft, even though most of that support is in the southern states, and Roosevelt is arguing that those states shouldn't matter since they're going to go Democrat anyway in the general election. So Roosevelt tries to ally with Bob La Follette and create a Stop Taft movement, but it really doesn't take off. So Roosevelt, having not gotten the nomination for the Republican Party, basically rage quits the party. He accuses Taft of fraud and then just leaves and creates a third party. He decides he's going to run as a separate candidate, as an independent candidate. He creates a new party that he calls the Bull Moose Party. This is supposed to be like the progressive party where all the progressives can kind of gather under the banner of the Bull Moose Party. But like I said earlier, the progressive party is really diverse, and so not everyone agrees on what being progressive means. So there's not like a single progressive platform. The word means different things to different people. In fact, there is a strain of progressives, and this is not all of them. Hashtag not all progressives. But there's this strain of them that are socialists or even more extreme, and that's why this election has a 4th major candidate, and that is Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party. Yes, the American Socialist Party makes a really big showing in the 1912 election because, for a lot of the reasons I already mentioned about labor issues, socialism is actually pretty popular at the time. Before this election, the Socialist Party had people elected in 33 states in well over 100 cities all over the country, especially in the Midwest. So Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate, he had run for president as a socialist 3 times before this. He's going to run again after this, and he sees himself as a moderate within the Socialist Party, like between a more radical fringe of the Socialist Party and a more conservative wing of the Socialist Party. So there's this 4-way race, and basically everyone is trying to compete for the progressive vote. All 4 candidates are trying to cast themselves as the true voice of the progressive movement. My favorite moment in this campaign comes pretty late when Teddy Roosevelt is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He's meeting with some supporters there, and he's walking out of his hotel to go to his car so that he can deliver a speech. As he's walking to the car, some guy runs up to Roosevelt, pulls a gun out, and shoots him right in the chest. TR's like, oh, and he's like feeling around. He's going, oh my gosh, am I okay? Teddy Roosevelt refuses to go to the hospital. He instead goes to the place that he's supposed to go give his speech. He walks out on stage, bullet still in his chest, not dressed or anything. He walks out and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." That's not a paraphrase, that's a direct quote. So after the votes are all tallied, Debs, the socialist, gets 6% of the vote, which sounds small, but that is the best that the Socialist Party had ever done. It shows that there was major support for those ideas in the country at the time. Taft ends up getting 3rd place. Roosevelt, the third party outsider, gets 2nd place, beating the main Republican candidate. No third party has done as well as this since then. And because Roosevelt had kind of split the Republican ticket, the guy that ends up winning the whole election is Woodrow Wilson. And I'm sure he never does anything controversial ever. So that's 1912 in a nutshell. Come back next time when I'll go about 50 years before and talk about the weirdness of the 1877 election. Thanks, we'll see you later.